On October 12, 2002, the Miller family, David, Sarah, and their 8-year-old daughter Emily, vanished from the heart of their own community during the annual Founders Day Festival in Harmony Creek, West Virginia. They were seen laughing by the town bonfire, surrounded by hundreds of friends and neighbors, and then they were simply gone. For 12 long years, their disappearance was a gaping wound in the town's soul, a mystery with no clues, no suspects, and no answers. The case file gathered dust, relegated to the cold archives of the unsolvable. That is, until a small, mud-caked wooden chest, unearthed by pure chance near an old stone wall, changed everything. How is it possible that the chilling truth remained buried for so long, just yards away from where they were last seen alive? Before we pry open that chest and expose the dark conspiracy it held within its decaying frame, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and be sure to subscribe to our channel. The contents of this box didn't just solve a missing persons case. They ignited a firestorm that threatened to burn down the carefully constructed facade of a peaceful, all-American town. The note found inside, written in a trembling hand, pointed not to a random act of violence but to a calculated, cold-blooded execution rooted in a secret the town had tried desperately to forget. Believe me, you won't want to miss the shocking chain of events this one accidental discovery set in motion, because it proves that some secrets can't stay buried forever. The last moments of the Miller family's life together were deceptively ordinary, steeped in the comforting traditions of small-town America. The crisp autumn air of Harmony Creek was filled with the smell of wood smoke and kettle corn. David, a respected carpenter known for his quiet strength, held his daughter Emily's hand. Sarah, a beloved first-grade teacher whose warmth could calm any child, was seen sharing a cup of hot apple cider with her husband. Witnesses remember Emily's face, illuminated by the flickering bonfire and the colorful glow stick she waved like a magic wand. Around 9 p.m., just as the first firework was about to light up the night sky, they waved to a neighbor. They were there one moment, swallowed by the cheerful crowd, and then they were not. The immediate aftermath was a storm of confusion and disorganization. When the sun rose on October 13th, and the Millers' car was still parked near the festival grounds, a quiet unease quickly curdled into panic. The initial police investigation was a forensic nightmare. The field, the scene of the disappearance, had been trampled by thousands of feet, erasing any potential evidence. Without a crime scene, a ransom note, or any sign of a struggle, investigators were left grasping at straws. They floated theories ranging from a kidnapping gone wrong to a family that had simply decided to walk away from their lives, leaving everything behind. But those who knew the Millers knew that was impossible. They were the bedrock of the community, not the type to just vanish into thin air. For Sarah's younger sister, Rachel, the 12 years that followed were a waking nightmare, a life suspended in the agonizing space between hope and despair. She became the sole keeper of the Miller family's memory, a reluctant detective driven by a sister's unwavering love. Every week she would replace the sun-bleached missing posters that hung limply on telephone poles and in storefront windows. She refused to let the town forget. The Millers' home was kept exactly as they had left it, a perfect time capsule of October 12, 2002. A half-finished puzzle sat on the coffee table, school books were stacked on the kitchen counter, and Emily's little coat was still hanging by the door. It was a silent, heartbreaking vigil, a constant and painful reminder of a family stolen in the night. As years bled into one another, a heavy silence settled over Harmony Creek. The Miller family's name became something spoken in hushed tones, their story evolving from a tragic mystery into a local ghost story, a cautionary tale for children who wandered too far from their parents at the annual festival. The event continued each year, a forced celebration that always felt haunted by the ghosts of the family who disappeared from its very heart. The community, in an act of collective self-preservation, had subconsciously agreed to move on. The open wound had scarred over, but beneath the surface, the poison of an unanswered question remained. The town had learned to live with the not knowing, never suspecting that the answer was buried just beneath their feet, waiting for a single shovel to strike the truth. The initial investigation, led by the town's long-standing Sheriff Brody, was doomed from the start. The festival grounds were a forensic black hole, a canvas wiped clean by thousands of unknowing feet. Every potential footprint, every dropped item, every trace of a struggle was lost in a chaotic sea of celebration. Without a starting point, the police were adrift. They interviewed hundreds of festival-goers, but everyone's memory was a blur of faces, fireworks, and bonfire smoke. The Millers had simply dissolved into the background noise of the night. Sheriff Brody's public statements were vague and reassuring, but behind the scenes, his small department was overwhelmed and out of its depth. They were looking for a needle in a haystack, without any certainty that a needle even existed. The first 48 hours, the most critical in any missing persons case, slipped away with nothing to show for it but a growing sense of dread. Frustrated by the lack of physical evidence, the investigation quickly devolved into a series of flawed theories. The first was kidnapping for ransom, a theory that died within a week when no call ever came. Then, investigators began to float the idea of a voluntary escape. They quietly probed the Millers' finances, looking for hidden debts or signs of a secret life. They found nothing. David and Sarah were financially stable, deeply rooted in their community, and devoted to their daughter. The suggestion that they would orchestrate their own disappearance, abandoning their home and their family, was not just improbable, it was an insult to their memory. To Rachel, it felt like a second violation, a character assassination designed to explain away the department's own failure to find answers. She knew her sister, and she knew this was not a family that ran from anything. For Rachel, the first few years were a blur of sleepless nights and agonizing days. Hope was a cruel, flickering candle in a storm of despair. Every phone call made her heart leap into her throat, only to have it crash back down when it was just another well-meaning neighbor, or, worse, a reporter looking for a new angle on the tragedy. She became an unwilling expert in the grim lexicon of missing persons cases, forensics, search grids, dental records. The police station became a second home, a place of constant frustration where she pleaded with detectives who seemed to have already accepted the case was unsolvable. The uncertainty was a physical weight, a constant pressure behind her eyes. Was her sister alive, being held somewhere? Was she hurt? Or was she gone forever? The not knowing was a special kind of torture, a wound that could never scab over. The investigation officially went cold in 2005, just 3 years after the Millers vanished. The case file, already thick with dead-end leads and unsubstantiated tips, was unceremoniously boxed up and moved to the archives. For the Harmony Creek Police Department, it was a matter of resource allocation. For Rachel, it was an act of abandonment. The detective assigned to the case was nearing retirement and spoke to her with a tired sympathy that bordered on pity. He promised they would never truly close the case, but his words were hollow. The phone call stopped. The official search was over. Rachel was left utterly alone, armed with nothing but a sister's instinct and a refusal to let the world forget. She realized then that the system she had been taught to trust had failed her completely. If justice was ever to be found for David, Sarah, and Emily, it would not come from a badge. This abandonment forced Rachel into a new, solitary role, the keeper of the flame. Her life became a ritual of remembrance. She continued to print and distribute missing person flyers on her own dime, her face becoming a familiar, sorrowful fixture in the towns and counties surrounding Harmony Creek. She organized annual vigils on the anniversary of the disappearance, standing with a small, dwindling group of supporters near the festival grounds, holding a candle against the encroaching darkness. The Miller house, which she now owned but could not bear to change, remained her greatest burden and her most sacred duty. She would visit weekly, dusting furniture that no one used, and watering plants that had long since been replaced. The house was no longer a home. It was a monument to a moment frozen in time, a silent testament to a life stolen without explanation. Over the years, the town of Harmony Creek developed a complicated relationship with its own tragedy. The annual Founders Day Festival became a somber affair, forever tainted by the memory of the family that disappeared from its midst. Some residents avoided it altogether, while others attended with a heavy heart, their eyes inevitably drawn to the spot by the river where the Millers were last seen. The disappearance became woven into the town's folklore, a ghost story whispered to spook children. It was a convenient way to process the unthinkable, to turn a raw, open wound into a sanitized legend. This collective coping mechanism, however, also served to push the real family, the living, breathing people who had been lost, further into the shadows. They were becoming characters in a story, their humanity slowly eroding with each passing year of silence. The silence was punctuated by moments of cruel, heart-stopping hope. About 5 years into the search, a truck driver in Ohio called the National Tip Line, claiming he had given a ride to a family matching the Millers' description just days after they vanished. He remembered the little girl's bright eyes and the parents' exhausted, haunted expressions. For 2 weeks, Rachel lived on a knife's edge of adrenaline and prayer. She drove to Ohio, plastered flyers in every truck stop along the interstate, and worked with a local detective who took a personal interest in the lead. The hope was intoxicating, a powerful drug that made her feel alive again. But it was all for nothing. Security footage from a nearby gas station eventually revealed that the family the trucker had helped was not the Millers. The crash back to reality was brutal, leaving Rachel more broken and isolated than before. Then, on a sweltering afternoon in September 2014, the silence was broken not by a confession or a police breakthrough, but by the dull thud of a shovel against wood. A young city employee named Liam, barely a teenager when the Millers vanished, was tasked with clearing a patch of overgrown land near the riverbank, an area long neglected since the festival had been relocated years ago. He was clearing thickets of thorny brush near a crumbling stone wall when his spade hit something solid. Thinking it was just a rock, he dug around it, only to unearth a small, mud-caked wooden chest, its hinges rusted nearly shut. It was small enough to be a child's treasure box, but it felt heavy with more than just dirt. Its presence there, half buried and forgotten, felt strangely deliberate. With a mix of youthful curiosity and a faint sense of unease, Liam used the edge of his shovel to pry the corroded latch open. The wood groaned in protest, and a musty smell of damp earth and decay filled the air. Inside, resting on a bed of rotted fabric, were 3 items that made the air go cold in his lungs. The first was a photograph, faded and water-damaged, but the smiling faces were unmistakable. It was David, Sarah, and little Emily Miller, captured in a moment of happiness. Beside it lay a small handmade bracelet of colorful plastic beads, the kind an 8-year-old girl would proudly make at summer camp. It was a deeply personal, heartbreakingly innocent artifact to find in such a grim, lonely place. The objects weren't just clues, they were ghosts. Liam's hand trembled as he picked up the photograph. The image was a gut punch, a direct link to the town's most painful memory. But it was what he found on the back that turned his discovery from a tragedy into something far more sinister. In shaky, deliberate handwriting, scrawled in faded ink, was a single, chilling sentence. It read, "They tried to claim this ground. Now the ground claims them." The words hung in the humid air, thick with malice and a chilling finality. This was no longer a story of a family who got lost or walked away. This was a statement. A cold, calculated epitaph written by a killer. It was a direct confession that had been lying dormant just yards from where the family was last seen. A wave of cold fear washed over Liam. He was holding evidence of a murder, a triple homicide that his town had tried to forget. His first instinct was to call the police, but he hesitated. He had grown up hearing the stories from his parents, the whispers about Sheriff Brody's inept investigation, and the department's quickness to close the file. He knew of Rachel's lonely, decade-long fight for answers, a fight the authorities had all but ignored. In that moment, he made a decision. This discovery didn't belong to the institution that had failed the Millers so completely. It belonged to the one person who had never given up on them. He carefully closed the chest, wiped the dirt from his hands, and knew he had to take it to Rachel. When Rachel opened her door to find a nervous young man holding a muddy box, she braced herself for another well-meaning, but ultimately hollow gesture of sympathy. But when Liam opened the lid, the air left her body in a single, ragged gasp. She recognized the bracelet instantly. She had helped Emily string those very beads just a week before she disappeared. The sight of it was a physical blow. collapsing 12 years of guarded hope in a single, brutal second. She took the photograph with a shaking hand, her thumb tracing the outline of her sister's face. Then Liam, his voice barely a whisper, told her to turn it over. As she read the words, the grief that had been her constant companion for over a decade morphed into something new, a cold, hard, clarifying rage. The cryptic phrase, "claim this ground," echoed in her mind, unlocking a dusty corner of her memory. She suddenly recalled fragments of tense phone calls she had overheard, her brother-in-law David's voice tight with frustration. He had been talking about old property lines, about deeds and titles, about a group of local landowners he was trying to organize. At the time, she had dismissed it as a boring local dispute, something she didn't need to worry about. But now, seen through the lens of this terrifying message, those forgotten conversations took on a new and horrifying significance. David hadn't just stumbled into a random act of violence. He had been targeted. His fight wasn't just about land. It was a fight that had gotten his entire family killed. Holding the chest in her lap, Rachel knew she was at a crossroads. The box and its contents were undeniable proof of a crime, a direct challenge to the official narrative that had stood for 12 years. But taking it to the Harmony Creek police felt like delivering a weapon back into the hands of an enemy. Sheriff Brody was retired, but his successor was his hand-picked protege, and the department's culture of sweeping uncomfortable truths under the rug remained. The note wasn't just a clue, it was a threat from someone who believed they were powerful enough to make a family disappear without a trace. Rachel realized she couldn't fight this power from within the system. She needed an outsider, someone with the resources and the will to blow the lid off a secret the town had protected for far too long. Her first call was not to the Harmony Creek police, but to a number she'd kept scribbled on a notepad for years. Mark Jennings, an investigative reporter for a regional newspaper known for his relentless pursuit of cold cases and small-town corruption. For 12 years, Rachel had trusted the system, and it had rewarded her with silence and condescending pity. That trust was now shattered. Handing the chest over to the same department that had dismissed her family's disappearance felt like a betrayal. She met Jennings in a diner 2 towns over, the muddy chest sitting between them on the vinyl booth seat. As she recounted the story, Jennings didn't take notes. He just listened, his eyes fixed on the photograph of the smiling family. And Rachel felt, for the first time in over a decade, that she wasn't screaming into a void. Someone was finally listening. Jennings began his work not at the police station, but in the dusty archives of the county courthouse. He understood that the note wasn't about a random crime. It was about the land itself. He spent weeks poring over property deeds, zoning applications, and town meeting minutes from the years leading up to 2002. He was searching for a conflict, a point of friction that could explain the phrase, "claim this ground." The work was tedious, a slow and methodical reconstruction of David Miller's life through public records. He discovered David was more than just a carpenter. He was a meticulous record keeper who had filed multiple inquiries about land transfers around Harmony Creek, questioning the legality of several large purchases made by a single, shadowy LLC that seemed to be buying up ancestral plots for pennies on the dollar. The name behind that LLC was the first major break in the case, Caldwell Development. The company was owned by Silas Caldwell, a powerful and feared local tycoon who had built an empire on real estate. Publicly, Caldwell was a philanthropist, his name etched onto the town library and the high school football stadium. Privately, he was known for his ruthless business tactics. Jennings found a pattern. Caldwell would target elderly landowners or families facing financial hardship, pressuring them into selling properties that had been in their families for generations. David Miller's own small workshop bordered one of the largest tracts of land Caldwell had acquired for his planned luxury resort. Suddenly, the quiet carpenter was no longer a random victim. He was an obstacle. The next piece of the puzzle came from a microfiche archive of the old Harmony Creek Herald. In an article from July 2002, just 3 months before the disappearance, Jennings found a report on a heated town hall meeting. David Miller was quoted, speaking eloquently and passionately against a rezoning petition submitted by Caldwell Development. He wasn't just a concerned citizen, he was an organizer, presenting evidence that Caldwell's company was using fraudulent surveys to devalue neighboring properties before making their lowball offers. He had publicly challenged the most powerful man in the county. The reporter's blood ran cold. The note wasn't a killer's taunt, it was a justification. David Miller had tried to claim the ground for his community, and for that, the ground had claimed him. Armed with this new context, Jennings began tracking down the other families mentioned in David's old notes. Many refused to speak, their fear of Silas Caldwell still palpable even after more than a decade. But one widow, whose husband had been David's closest ally in the fight, finally broke her silence. She showed Jennings a box of her late husband's files. Inside was correspondence between him and David, detailing their plan to file a class-action lawsuit against Caldwell Development. The final piece of evidence they were waiting on, a sworn affidavit from a disgruntled former surveyor for Caldwell, was scheduled to be delivered to David on October 12, 2002, the night of the Founders Day Festival. He was supposed to meet the man near the riverbank to receive the documents that would have exposed Caldwell's entire criminal enterprise. The investigation then turned to the man who had officially buried the case, former Sheriff Brody. Jennings discovered that 6 months after the Miller investigation was declared cold, Brody retired. Public records showed that shortly after, his wife purchased a prime piece of real estate adjacent to Caldwell's resort. For a price so far below market value, it was practically a gift. The seller was a holding company directly linked to Caldwell Development. It was a blatant, thinly veiled payoff. The sheriff hadn't just botched the investigation, he had actively suffocated it. He had been Caldwell's insurance policy, ensuring that any inconvenient questions about the Millers' disappearance would be met with a bureaucratic brick wall. The town's protector had been the conspiracy's gatekeeper. The final chilling detail came from a former deputy who had left Harmony Creek in 2003, haunted by the case. Jennings found him working as a security guard in another state.
After being guaranteed anonymity,
the ex-deputy confessed that on the night of the festival, Sheriff Brody had given a direct and unusual order. All patrol units were to avoid the secluded access road by the river, citing that Caldwell's private security team was handling that area.
This created a dead zone,
a pocket of unpoliced territory in the middle of the town's biggest celebration. It was the perfect stage. David Miller wasn't lured to a random, quiet spot. He was guided into a kill box, one that had been sanctioned and protected by the highest level of local law enforcement. Every piece was now in place, revealing not just a murder, but a cold, calculated execution orchestrated from the top down. The breaking point came in the form of a man named Frank Gable, Silas Caldwell's former construction foreman. Tracked down by Jennings to a rundown trailer park 3 states away, Gable was a ghost of his former self, a man hollowed out by a decade of guilt. When Jennings and Rachel arrived, he didn't fight. He just sat at his small kitchen table, his hands trembling so violently he couldn't light a cigarette. The reporter's articles had backed him into a corner, dredging up a past he had tried to drink away. Looking at Rachel's face, a mirror image of the woman he had helped murder, something inside him finally shattered. The confession didn't come in a flood, but as a slow, agonizing trickle of truth, each word a heavy stone he was finally setting down after 12 years of carrying the weight. He began with the night of the festival. The plan, he explained, was never supposed to end in murder. It was meant to be an intimidation, a final, brutal warning. Caldwell had ordered him and 2 other men to get David Miller to the secluded riverbank, using the pretense of a last-minute negotiation to get him to drop the lawsuit. They were to use the noise and chaos of the fireworks as cover to scare him, to make him understand that he was messing with forces far beyond his control. David was supposed to meet them alone, receive the message, and walk away terrified but alive. The meeting was timed perfectly to coincide with the grand finale of the fireworks display, ensuring that any raised voices or sounds of a struggle would be completely swallowed by the celebratory explosions overhead. The fatal miscalculation, the one that turned a threat into a massacre, was that David didn't come alone. He had brought Sarah and Emily with him, thinking they would just wait a short distance away while he had a quick, final conversation. When Gable and the other men saw them, Sarah standing protectively by her daughter, Emily's face lit by the glow stick in her hand. A cold panic set in. They radioed Caldwell, who was watching from a distance, and his orders came back, cold and absolute. There could be no witnesses. The plan had changed in a heartbeat. Sarah and Emily had seen their faces. Their presence had just signed the entire family's death warrant. The moment was no longer about intimidation. It had become about eradication, about wiping a problem completely off the map. The confrontation escalated with sickening speed. David, realizing he had been lured into a trap, stood his ground, refusing to be bullied. His courage, in the end, was what sealed their fate. A vicious argument erupted, and one of Caldwell's men struck David. When Sarah screamed, the situation devolved into pure, unrestrained violence. It was quick, brutal, and horribly efficient. In the shadow of the cheering town, under a sky lit with brilliant bursts of color, the Miller family was extinguished. There was no time for pleas or goodbyes. It was just the cold, hard finality of 3 lives being erased from existence, their last moments a terrifying counterpoint to the sounds of joy and celebration just a few hundred yards away. The silence that followed was more deafening than any firework. The cover-up was just as calculated as the crime. Under the cover of total darkness, they moved the bodies. Caldwell's new resort development was already underway. The land cleared and foundation plots marked out. They used a backhoe that was already on the property, digging a deep, unmarked grave on the very land David Miller had died trying to protect. They laid the family to rest there, and by sunrise the ground was level again. 2 days later, a concrete slab was poured for the foundation of what would become Cabin 7 of the Caldwell Riverfront Resort. The Millers had vanished, their final resting place a permanent, chilling secret, entombed beneath the feet of wealthy vacationers who had come to admire the pristine West Virginia landscape, never knowing the horror it concealed. Gable's confession filled in the final pieces. The small wooden chest, he admitted, was his doing. Years later, eaten alive by what he'd done, he dug up the few personal items they had taken from the family that night. He couldn't bring himself to destroy them. He placed them in the chest and buried it near the old festival grounds. A desperate, cowardly act of penance. A message in a bottle for a truth he was too terrified to speak aloud. He also confirmed the role of Sheriff Brody.
A single call from Silas Caldwell
That night had ensured the access road by the river was a complete dead zone, free of any police patrols. The sheriff wasn't just incompetent, he was an active and willing accomplice, paid handsomely for his silence with a piece of the very land the Millers had been murdered over. With Gable's full confession recorded and a sworn affidavit signed, the wheels of justice, frozen for 12 long years, began to grind into motion. It wasn't the Harmony Creek police who were called, but the state investigators. The operation was swift and decisive. In the pre-dawn light, a convoy of state police vehicles descended on the Caldwell Riverfront Resort, sealing it off. As the sun rose over the mountains, heavy excavation equipment was brought in, rolling across the manicured lawns toward Cabin 7. Rachel stood at the police cordon, wrapped in a blanket, watching as a machine's steel claw began to break apart the concrete foundation. She didn't weep. She just watched, her gaze fixed, waiting for the ground to finally give up the secret it had been forced to keep for more than a decade. It took less than an hour for the excavator to break through the concrete. As the first section of the foundation was lifted away, a hush fell over the assembled crowd. Forensic anthropologists in white suits descended into the pit, their movements slow and deliberate. For Rachel, time seemed to warp. The 12 years of waiting, of imagining every possible scenario, culminated in this single, silent moment. She didn't cry when a state investigator approached her, his face etched with grim confirmation. There was no relief, only the hollow, crushing weight of a truth finally made real. The agonizing question of where had been answered. Her family was home, but not in the way she had ever allowed herself to hope. The long, brutal vigil was over, and a new, more profound grief was just beginning. The arrests were swift and clinical, a stark contrast to the chaotic disappearance 12 years prior. State police cruisers rolled up the long, manicured driveway to Silas Caldwell's estate just after dawn. He was arrested on his marble patio, a cup of coffee still steaming in his hand, his expression one of indignant disbelief rather than fear. The mask of the town benefactor had been ripped away, revealing the cold-blooded killer beneath. Former Sheriff Brody was taken into custody at his home, the one built on the land he had received as payment for his silence. News of the arrest spread through Harmony Creek like a wildfire, shattering the town's carefully constructed peace. The man whose name was on their library was a murderer, and the man they had trusted to protect them was his accomplice. The betrayal cut deeper than anyone could have imagined. The trial of Silas Caldwell was a media spectacle that put Harmony Creek under a national microscope. The courtroom was packed every day, a silent theater for the town's darkest drama. Caldwell, impassive and arrogant, listened as the case against him was built, piece by damning piece. The prosecution's star witness was Frank Gable, a man so visibly broken by guilt that his testimony was delivered in a choked whisper, each word a painful exorcism. He recounted the events of that night in horrifying detail, never once looking at Caldwell. But the most powerful presence in the room was Rachel. She sat in the front row every single day, a silent, unwavering testament to the family that was lost. When the jury returned with a guilty verdict on all counts, a collective breath was released. It wasn't a celebration. It was a quiet, solemn acknowledgement of a debt finally being paid. 3 weeks after the verdict, the Miller family was finally laid to rest. The funeral was held in the small-town church, but the crowd spilled out onto the lawn, a sea of faces reflecting a community grappling with its own complicity and grief. Nearly everyone in Harmony Creek was there, paying their respects not just to the family they had lost, but to the illusion of safety they had all clung to for so long. Rachel delivered the eulogy, her voice steady and clear. She didn't speak of the murder or the trial. She spoke of her sister's infectious laugh, of David's quiet kindness, and of Emily's boundless curiosity about the world. For the first time, she was able to mourn them, not as victims of a mystery, but as the people she loved. It was a painful, necessary farewell, the final chapter in her long search. In the years that followed, Rachel found a new purpose. She sold the Miller house, understanding that it could never be a home again, and used the funds to establish the Heritage and Home Foundation, quote, a nonprofit offering legal aid to rural families facing predatory land developers. It was a living tribute to David's fight. The Caldwell Riverfront Resort, now a monument to a terrible crime, was seized by the state, torn down, and the land was eventually donated back to the town. Where Cabin 7 once stood, there is now a simple, quiet memorial park. A small stone plaque bears the names David, Sarah, and Emily Miller, along with a single sentence, "The ground belongs to those who cherish it." It was a final, poignant answer to the killer's cold epitaph. Harmony Creek was never the same. The tragedy forced a painful reckoning, revealing the deep cracks in its idyllic facade. The Founders Day Festival continues, but it is a more somber, reflective event, forever haunted by the memory of the family that vanished from its heart. The story of the Millers became a permanent part of the town's identity, a dark lesson about the secrets that can fester beneath the surface of a close-knit community. The silence that had once protected a killer was replaced by a new understanding that true community is not built on forgetting, but on facing the truth, no matter how painful it may be. The scar on the town's soul remains, a permanent reminder of the cost of greed and the enduring power of a sister's love. If you believe that no victim should be forgotten and that the search for truth is essential, please share this story. Don't forget to subscribe for more deep investigations into cases that demand to be told. Thank you for listening. The truth, once unearthed, sent a seismic shock through the foundations of Harmony Creek. The town was forced to look in the mirror and confront the ugly reality it had ignored for over a decade. The man they had celebrated as a pillar of the community was a cold-blooded killer, and the sheriff they had trusted was his paid accomplice. This was a betrayal on an institutional level, a poison that had seeped into the very soul of the town. There was a period of collective shame, a quiet, heavy atmosphere where neighbors looked at each other differently, wondering who else knew, who else suspected, and who else chose silence. The illusion of small-town safety was shattered forever, replaced by the hard-won knowledge that evil doesn't always come from the outside. Sometimes, it grows right in your own backyard, nurtured by fear and willful ignorance. For Rachel, the end of the trial was not an end to her pain, but a transformation of it. The frantic energy of her 12-year search was gone, leaving behind a profound and quiet grief. She could finally mourn her family not as missing persons, but as victims of a terrible injustice. In the months that followed, she found a new way to channel her unwavering resolve. She sold the Miller home, a place too heavy with memories to ever be a home again, and used the proceeds to create the, quote, Heritage and Home Foundation. It was a nonprofit dedicated to providing legal assistance to rural families fighting predatory land developers, the very fight that had cost David his life. It was her way of ensuring that the Miller family name would be remembered, not for how they died, but for the principles they died defending. Her personal crusade had become a public service. The physical landscape of Harmony Creek also bore the scars and, eventually, the symbols of this reckoning. The Caldwell Riverfront Resort, a monument to greed built on a foundation of murder, was seized by the state. It stood empty for 2 years, a ghost on the riverbank, before it was finally demolished. The land was then donated to the town to be reclaimed as a public space. Where the concrete slab of Cabin 7 once concealed a horrific crime, there is now a quiet memorial park. A simple, unadorned stone sits at its center, engraved with the names of David, Sarah, and Emily Miller. Beneath their names is a single, powerful line that reclaims the narrative from their killer. The ground belongs to those who cherish it. It serves as a permanent, poignant answer to the malice that had remained buried for so long. The story of the Miller family has since become woven into the permanent identity of Harmony Creek. It is no longer a ghost story whispered at festivals, but a historical lesson taught with solemn respect. It serves as a stark reminder that the fabric of a community is only as strong as its willingness to protect its most vulnerable members, and that silence in the face of power can be a fatal accomplice to injustice. The Founders Day Festival continues, but its tone has irrevocably shifted. Every year, as the fireworks light up the night sky, a moment of silence is observed. It is a moment to remember the family that was stolen from their midst, and to honor the persistence that refused to let them be forgotten, ensuring that the town's darkest chapter would also become its most important lesson. The Miller family's story is a testament to the enduring power of a single voice against a chorus of silence. It reminds us that justice, even when delayed for years, can still be found if one person refuses to let the truth stay buried. It is a story about the deep roots of community, both the good and the evil, and how the fight for a small piece of land can represent the larger battle for the soul of a place. The ground in Harmony Creek now holds a memorial, not a secret, because one sister's love proved stronger than one man's greed. The final justice for David, Sarah, and Emily was not just a verdict in a courtroom. It was the reclamation of their story, ensuring they would be remembered not as victims who vanished, but as a family who mattered.